Hello and welcome to Live Coding Happy Hour on this fabulous January 23rd, 2020. We are going to have a fun show today. We got the whole crew here, the originals, all back here for the Orlando release party. So let's go ahead and get right into introductions, and whoever goes first wins. No, Dave, let's have you.
I'm Dave Slusher. I am, for the first time ever, reporting here as a senior software engineer on the Integration Hub team.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Josh.
Hi, and I'm Josh Nerius. I am a principal product manager in the platform team for Integration Hub.
That's about as high as you go.
Wonderful. And Chuck.
Hi, I'm Chuck Tomasi, Senior TPMM. I don't know what else to say to this. So you guys know who I am and where I find me.
Wonderful. Well, hello, I'm Andrew Barnes, developer advocate here at ServiceNow. We are going to have just a fun day today. Let's go ahead and jump into beers, and then we'll get into what we're going to do today in Orlando. So same order.
All right, I've got a fine standard American Rolling Rock, which doesn't really play well with my green screen because of the logo. But I sort of was a little unprepared to do the show, so I didn't have anything particularly fancy. So Rolling Rock it is. Latrobe, Pennsylvania.
Nice. And I've got an Empirical Brewery Singularity Oatmeal, also not playing well with the, there we go.
You have to put it like over your face. Nice.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. It's an oatmeal stout. It's seasonal.
And Chuck.
I've got a Guinness Blonde, which apparently does play pretty well with the green screen.
Nice. And I have got a New Belgium Voodoo Ranger Juicifer, which is from Asheville.
I have had that, and I am jealous.
Oh, well, I've never had it, but I love New Belgium stuff, so hopefully it's delicious. All right, so if you don't know, Orlando went into early access yesterday. So out on the blog, we released an announcement that the personal developer instances are available to be upgraded or requested as Orlando. The doc site was updated with the Orlando documentation. There's lots of enablement coming during this early access period before we get into general availability. This is the first show that we're getting to show any Orlando features on, and I thought it would be fun to have our friends Josh and Dave, who are both tightly coupled with Integration Hub and Flow Designer, to come in and talk about some of the things that we can do in Integration Hub and Flow Designer in Orlando. So Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're going to do today?
Yeah, sounds good. So we did a lot of work in Integration Hub, bunch of new features. The ones we're going to focus on are primarily centered on making auth easier. So surprise, surprise, we're going to talk about authentication on Live Coding Happy Hour. So we're going to talk about making authentication easier. And then in New York, we added this thing called dynamic inputs, which I think we've talked about on Live Coding Happy Hour before. Mm-hmm. But in Orlando, we now have a thing called dynamic outputs. So if you have ever had a situation where you're building an action and you're getting data from another system, and that system can return a variable amount of data, maybe a different schema or different columns, dynamic inputs is all about dynamically changing what's available in the data pane so that you can adapt to those different environments. So we're going to hopefully get a working authentication template configuration working today. We'll talk about what that is. And then the same thing with dynamic outputs. We're going to try to set one up and see how that goes.
That'd be cool, because I need to build one of those.
Yeah, this is quite timely, because the first spoke that I'm building as part of this new role is there was a discussion today of using dynamic outputs. I'm like, I don't know anything about dynamic outputs.
They're pretty cool. when you get the concept down of using another action, almost like a subroutine, mm-hmm. that's really pretty cool. Anyway, let's take it away, Josh.
Let's dive in.
So the fun part is I don't know much about it either. So this is going to be a fun ride.
Hopefully it doesn't feel that much different than dynamic inputs, which we've done before.
We'll start with the authentication stuff.
Yeah, let's start with my happy place of authentication.
That is your happy place.
It really is. It really is. So I'm going to get my screen sharing going Bear with me a second.
No problem.
And if you could just let me know if you can indeed see
I can
the
indeed
studio.
see.
All right. And let me turn off my camera so I can make weird faces without feeling bad about it.
And I love this idea because Josh, you and I have talked before, the YouTube authentication of using an API key. For whatever reason in New York, we're sticking the API key in the authorization header, and YouTube goes, no, that's not going to work. Thanks. So we need this new model to create the proper format.
Yeah. So let me first, just setting a little context. If you've seen live coding before, you know how challenging sometimes it can be to set up authentication. And in this case, what I want to show is the developer experience for configuring one of these new configuration templates, and then the admin experience, someone who's coming to actually set this thing up. So there are two very distinct personas, and the one that we're going to start with is you're a developer, you're building a spoke, you want to make it easy for the people who are going to use your spoke to set the thing up once they actually install it. So if we go to Integration Hub menu here, you'll see that we have this new thing called configuration templates. And when I go in there, it's empty. So let me create a new one. And what we've done is we've pre-filled a series of common configurations to get you started. And so just to get the first demo off the ground, I'll use an API key credential. How's that?
Love it.
So what this does is this brings us to this new form. And what this form is all about is this is all about how do we decide what information we want to ask the user to give us, and then what are we going to do with that information to actually set up authentication. So for this, we're just going to call this API key demo, and I'll save it. And without doing anything, we're going to go and see what this actually looks like now in an alias. So let me go to the alias table. And I'll open that up in a new tab so we can go back and forth easily. And I'm going to create a new alias. I'm just going to call this Google Sheets because we're going to be playing with Google Sheets a little bit later. So I might as well set it up for myself now and save some time. And now we'll say that the configuration template that we want to associate with this is this API key demo. So what this is doing,
that's one of the times where if you're building a spoke and you've created this alias and the configuration template, you would relate those together for deploying that spoke. And now we're to the consumer part of utilizing that authentication that's already templated for us here now.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So if you think about the process that you would go through in the past and you're defining this alias, now this is an additional step on top of defining the alias to attach this thing to it. And we have this new button that says create new connection and credential. And what this does is this will actually launch the new configuration experience. So if I click that, you'll see that we now have this simple modal dialog, and we're asking you for some information about the connection as well as the credential. And this is just using demo data that was already in that default thing. So let me just plug in some values here, example.com, and then I'll just say something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, when I click create, I will not save that in my password manager. And then what this is doing is behind the scenes, it's going to go and it's going to generate a connection. It's going to generate a credential, and it's going to tie these things together. And you'll notice that the connection it created has some problems. It has this default provider name thing in there, which isn't quite what we want it to be. And so there are some things we need to go to clean up that template. But if I drill in, we can now see what the template's doing. So it created this record, and it plugged in that connection URL here. And then if I go into the credential, I'll open that up in a new tab. It automatically created this API key credential record, and the value that I put is over here. The really key takeaway with this at the moment is that in a single screen, we generated records in 2 tables. We didn't have to think about this in terms of how do I properly create a credential and then how do I link it to a connection. It was just, no, here's the things we need to enter. The system takes care of the rest.
It should be noted.
Go ahead, Dave.
Should be noted that was always the hardest problem with that, is that you always got into the position where you start to do a thing and you realize you need other records that don't exist yet.
Right.
And you never knew where the first place to start was.
Right.
Yeah. And there was sort of that back looping thing when you got to OAuth 2. It's like, wait, my scopes go here and the scope entities go. Like, wait, this takes care of all of that with like 2 fields. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it's so much more flexible, and I think that's a good segue to the next one, which is I'm just going to create another template, and this time I'm going to create an OAuth one, and we'll kind of play around with that and see what's in there. So we'll call this Google Sheets OAuth, and maybe we'll actually try to set this up for real. So if we actually start to look at the anatomy of these templates, you'll see that we've got this simple JSON payload. The structure lays out the various things that you might want to configure. So this is where some of that demo data was that we were seeing show up over in those records. So I'm just going to call this Google Sheets default profile. And then you'll see that here we can actually specify the entity scopes that we want. I'm going to copy a scope from off the screen and put it over here just so we can see what this looks like. We don't need to worry about this code challenge method. We also need to associate the scope with the profile we just created, and we're going to call this read sheets. If I can type. We don't have a revocation URL, so we're just going to leave that alone. We can specify our client ID. And then I'm going to reveal my client secret as well. So I'll have to clean that up after this broadcast. But I created this configuration specifically for today. So
but isn't the client ID and client secret where you're going to prompt for?
Well, so the client ID, actually, that's a good call, and I'm glad you said that. The client ID is something that, depending on what you've set up, you may want to hard code that. Okay. So if you know, so for example, if you were shipping an application and it was tightly bound to a particular client, you could actually set that up and pre-populate that if you wanted to. Now, it may be that you actually don't, and you want the user to specify that instead. So that's completely valid as well. And if we look down, So actually, to that point, for the purposes of today, let me just take that out. We'll leave that like it was. What else do we have? Google.
How does it know what to prompt for? Is it any of those fields that are empty, or?
So the prompt is based on the dynamic data schema. So there are two schemas here. The first one is the default data. This is the stuff we're always going to set up. So whatever we put here is going to get persisted into the various connection credential tables. Okay. Down at the bottom, we've got the dynamic data schema, and this is what we're asking the user for. And so this would be things that are specific to the customer. And so actually, this is pre-configured to ask for, here's the OAuth client ID, here's the OAuth client secret, and here's the redirect URL.
Gotcha. So for example, one of the things we added there was the scope. And for a given the scope is not necessarily something that we need to prompt the user for, because the way our spoke, when we developed it, is going to be set up to that other endpoint with already known scope requests for that OAuth token.
Yeah.
So we don't have to ask them.
Exactly. In the scope, that's one of the best examples of why you want to use that static schema, which is that why ask somebody to manually put something in that's error prone when, as a developer, these are the scopes that you need. That's not a question for the user. That's just a property or a configuration of the app that you've developed, similar to if you were building an action and you set up the connection URLs or the resource endpoints that you're going to call to actually get or put data. Those scopes are similar to that, and that it's just part of your app. You shouldn't be asking your users to put that in for you. So with that, let me save this one, and we'll see what happens.
And anytime you need me to hide the screen for pasting of a client secret before it saves or anything like that, just poke me, and I can bring up our shrubbery.
Aha!
Privacy shrubbery.
That's good to know. So let's go here and let's update our configuration template to Google Sheets.
You don't need to delete your old connection. There you go.
I probably do. Just to be safe.
Because why not?
At a minimum, I would need to set it to active as false, or we'll get some kind of an error. So now I click Create New, and
not to interrupt you too much there, but is there a way to undo this create? So there's things that are created that aren't necessarily directly referenceable here by that related list. You deleted the connection, but you didn't delete, for example, the credential. Is there like a reversal?
That's a great question, and the answer is not yet.
Okay,
So yeah,
that's fine.
Initially, yeah,
I just
right
wanted to know
now
if there was.
it's important to know that, and there is some manual cleanup that after you've created these configurations, if you want to get rid of them, it's your responsibility to go and clean them up as an admin or developer. Longer term, we continue or plan to continue to enhance that, but that's how it is today.
Yep.
So I'm just going to put in dummy values here again because I am not expecting this to fully work. But the thing that's interesting is you'll notice that we have this button that says create and get OAuth token. And what this is going to do, are you able to see my second pop-up? I'm not sure if Zoom is.
Nope.
Okay. All right. So you can't see this right now. And I don't know if I can get Zoom to.
It's your typical OAuth.
It's a typical Google auth asking for you to authorize what you've just requested, right?
Exactly. And so instead of making you go out there and navigate to the credential record and click that button, what we've done is we've baked it directly into the experience so that you can just jump right into the OAuth flow and set it up and go from there. So again, I want to highlight what we just generated, and we didn't clean up all the default values. So for demo purposes, let's just pretend those aren't there. But here's the connection we created. Here's the credential we created. And then most importantly, here's the OAuth profile we generated, which has this OAuth scope attached to it. Yeah. And then here is the actual registry record itself, which has the client ID, the secret, the auth URL, the redirect URL, all that stuff. And so
I agree with the clapping there. Like that.
Very good. I like the clapping. So pretty excited about this. This is really flexible. We're going to be able to continue to enhance this and make it easier. But the biggest thing is that now as a developer, you can take some of that pain away from the admins or even for yourself. So once you've set this up one time, you can now easily go and replicate it just by walking through that new connection creation experience.
And we've got some templates that we're shipping both generically and with the spokes that we ship. We'll ship the template for that spoke, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so we do have all those default templates that I showed you when you go to create a new one. And so those are kind of the starters that get you going. And then going forward for spokes that are compatible with Orlando and later, we'll have these templates built in. So you don't have to go through this whole process by yourself.
I could foresee some enterprising, maybe developer MVP group get together and make some even more generic templates and make that a share item is just a bunch of templates.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the thing. While this can be used to say, I want to set up a very specific spoke, you could actually make these templates generic enough to just get an OAuth config up and running, or just get, an API config up and running. And you can ask the user for more inputs. And so, there's flexibility there. The one last thing I wanted to show you on this is there's one feature I haven't talked about, which is we have at the bottom this post-processing script. And what this is for is what happens when all else fails. And yeah, we've created the OAuth template and the connection and the credential, but maybe there's something else that you need to do. Sometimes, yeah. So there may be an application that our own DocuSign spoke has some examples of this, where for each account you're talking to, there's a custom table with custom account record that's listed there because we're collecting other metadata about the third party. And so what you can do is you can actually define inputs in this dynamic data schema that don't tie back to anything. They're just inputs that you're asking the user to populate. And then in this post-processing script, this runs after these things have been created. And it gives you a reference to what was the alias this came from, what was the connection we just generated, and then what was the default and dynamic data in JSON form that were entered by the user. So you have access to...
You could prompt them for something like, for example, some table that this, particular connection needs to tie to, because you might have two of them or something, or multiple ones, and the thing needs to be flexible, and you take that input from when you're generating this, and then this post processing can do something with that data. All right, I like it, and I like that you've included some exampling there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were some of these get a little complicated, and so if you got into, say, the JWT bearer type, this is one of the most complicated OAuth configs, because it has not only the OAuth profile, but it has a JWT key and a certificate and all this other stuff. So like we probably should put some samples.
Hey, Dave, you would have liked something like this a year ago, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
3 years ago.
Imagine though, if we had this years ago, we probably wouldn't have been nearly as successful with live coding happy hour in the early days with all that authentication talk.
Yeah, how many have referenced Josh's old OAuth 2 videos?
Hopefully this will start to make those obsolete. So with that said, anything else we want to talk about, or questions about the template stuff, or we can maybe shift gears and start talking about dynamic outputs?
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Cool. So let's see. So shifting gears, the dynamic outputs feature, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to first create an action that has dynamic outputs just to prove and show that it works, and then actually try to hook it up to an API to make it dynamic. And that can be a less frustrating way of getting things done. So let me go to Flow Designer. And first, let's just look at how you even interact with these things. And the use case here is I have a Google Sheet, and I want to create an action that goes and gets a row from a Google Sheet, but I want to actually populate the outputs based on the columns in that particular sheet. And so maybe I have 3 columns, or maybe I have 10 columns, or maybe I have 50 columns. It just depends. And so if you think about a generic action that can go and fetch data from a spreadsheet, you kind of need that flexibility of saying, hey, when I pick a particular sheet, give me only the things that are in that sheet, and update the outputs accordingly. So that's the goal, and we'll see if we get there. So I'm going to create a new action, and we'll just say get row from sheet. And we're going to put it in the loading application.
I was watching that going, like, come on.
And so that's going to give me, some data pills that I can access in Flow after I use this action that contain those columns.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And then, the fields from that row. All right. I like it.
Yeah, because imagine if you said, like, I want to go and I want to create an output called row. And if I were to use, say, object, just a complex object, I can come in here and I can define my own columns, but I can't presume. Yeah, I can't presume to know what all the columns might be. And this might work with one sheet, but I would have to create a new action for every sheet that I want to interact with. And that's not.
And no thanks.
Nope, not what I want. So that hopefully will help highlight why we're doing this and what some of the value is. So let me get rid of those. We're going to go and pick this new thing called, hopefully we're going to pick this new thing called dynamic object. Uh-oh.
Plug-in time.
It is plug-in time. So
I checked before the stream for anything with Flow Designer and Integration Hub in my instance. So what's it called that it doesn't have Integration Hub or Flow Designer in its name?
That's an interesting question. It's probably called introspection.
Or dynamic something.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you don't mind looking for that,
I'll take care of it.
We'll use this as a learning moment to figure out how to activate the introspection plugin. So if you want to play with this, make sure you go and do that. And then while he's looking at that, what I want to look at is I'll start looking at the Google API to see what we've got. So I started playing a little bit with this. I haven't gotten too far. And there's this spreadsheets.get method, and I just wanted to get to the point where I could actually get a sheet And so if I look at this, they give me this little utility where I can test it out. I created a new sheet called LCHH, and the ID is in the URL. So if I copy that ID and then come back to this API testing tool, I'll try executing that and see what happens. There we go. I'm me. I'm going to let this thing do stuff with my sheets.
They don't have an open API we can just import?
That'd be cool, but I don't know.
I know YouTube does now.
So yeah, so it's got a bunch of scopes, and actually we'll probably have to set up some more of these scopes as we go. But the main thing here is that we're actually getting some metadata back. So here's the title. We see some details about its theme and a bunch of other stuff. And then we have a list of the sheets within there. So with that, what I want to do is see, can I see from this screen where the URL is that I just hit? Oh, here it is, down here. So we'll create an action to get information about a sheet.
This is the part that I latched onto or took me a second to get a hold of. It's like, oh, we're using an action to drive another action.
Yeah, that's where, yeah, it's a little interesting in that way. So that'll get a little interesting as we go.
And I think dynamic inputs was the same way, was it not?
Give your flow designer a reload to get your dynamic choices.
Okay, perfect. I will.
So what did you find, Andrew?
There is an introspection plugin. I thought that particular one was another different plugin that I wasn't supposed to install.
Gotcha.
Which shall not be named.
Fair enough. We'll talk about that later. All right, so now let me do a. Did it show up?
Full browser refresh.
I'm doing a full browser refresh. So I just opened it in a new tab.
Yeah. Did you open it in a new tab? Because
just did. So we'll see if that did it. That didn't do it. Let me delete the input and create a new one. There we go. Dynamic object. And so we're going to call this row. And then what's interesting is when we expand the details, you'll see that we now have advanced options. And so dynamic inputs and outputs are associated with an action. And what the action is doing is the action is defining, or it's returning the structure for what that object should look like. So in the case of an input, if it was a dynamic choice or a dynamic template, it's pulling back a list of values to show. And then in the case of a dynamic output, this action that we're going to pick is going to return the structure of the object. So, so what I need to do that is I need to go and create a new action. Actions inside actions inside actions.
Inside actions.
And we'll call this get sheet metadata.
Flow Designer Inception.
Yes.
It's now Inception Hub.
And what this action is we refer to these generically as data gathering actions. This is going to have a single output, appropriately enough call, I think, output, and I'll double check the docs on that. And then it has to have a specific type, so it has to be JSON. And so what this thing is doing is it's returning a very special structure of JSON with this name, and as long as an action meets this criteria, it will show up here as I go to define this as one of the options.
Probably need to save.
Yeah, I do need to save. So with that, let me save. Actually, let me add a step just to make Action Designer happy. I'll throw a rest step in there. And I'll just, I can't publish it yet.
empty output value cannot be blank on publish.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got the output value, but I haven't actually set an output. So for purposes of just getting it to show up, I'm just going to drag something in there that actually doesn't make sense, but it will let me show how these things link together. So now that I have this action with that output of that name of that type, and I come over here,
Hopefully it'll show up.
and I'll probably have to refresh. Oh no, it's right there.
It's
So
right
get
there.
sheet metadata. Boom. So that's how we define it. Now what we actually have to do is make this action do something useful. So to do that, I'm going to pull something up off screen. Actually, no, I'm going to pull it up on screen because there's an example that I want to refer to. And this is useful for anybody who's building these for themselves, because you may want to do the same thing, because I can't remember this stuff off the top of my head either. So if we look for dynamic in the actions, here we have get service now object schema dynamic. This is an example data gathering action that goes out and gets the metadata structure for another ServiceNow instance. So we can kind of use this to pattern as a pattern for what we're trying to build. So
Thank you for naming that way. You're getting the credit whether you did it or not. But so I have searched exactly that way for an example for dynamic outputs. What would be interesting is to have a method to be able to search for things inside of steps, like
I would love
particular
that.
steps, or to help me find which action is containing something that is an example for what I want.
That makes sense. I'll talk to the product manager about that.
Good, thank you.
So
it's like having a direct line to God.
Okay. On that note, so what this existing example action is doing, this is for that ServiceNow example, it's just hitting this metadata API inside ServiceNow. But what's more interesting is the script step, which is creating a very specific structure. And let's take a look at what that is. So what this object, or what this action rather, needs to return is this object. It has a single thing called data. It's going to have a type of object, and then it's going to have, or actually not a type of object, it's going to have a series of properties that then describe what the types and what the nested types and so on and so forth actually look like for this object structure. So if we go down and look, what this is doing is it's going out there and it's creating this thing where we're saying each element has a label, a name, and a type. And the output schema overall is going to look like this. It's going to be a type of object, and in this case, we have an array of all the elements. So this is roughly what we want to pattern this off of. And just to do a quick hard-coded example of what this looks like, I'm going to, try to do a hard-coded example of what this looks like. So we'll create a script step.
Hard coding makes you stronger, right?
Yes.
Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
And so we're just going to say schema equals, and I got to get rid of these. My copy paste has brought with it some things that I would prefer it did not. It's got some children. Just please, if you have OCD, ignore.
You can do an indent thing on there. Do the select all shift tab.
Select all shift tab. There we go. Thank you. I always forget that.
My OCD.
It was already making me start to feel really uncomfortable. So now we need an output here. So we'll say output. And actually, what I don't know, let's look over here at what this is doing. This is also JSON.
Outputs.schema equals.
Yeah.
And then
so
your
we'll
output variable is
schema.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Output schema equals schema.
Yeah.
There we go. And then finally, we need to take this and
Drag.
say the schema goes to the output of the action. So if I test this,
You should see action testing. Hooray.
boom, boom, boom.
Uh-oh.
Unable to load connection with alias ID. That's because I
Right,
put a
'cause
rest
it's
step
a
in
rest
there,
step in there.
Yep.
Yeah.
and I didn't do anything with it. So let me go fix that. Let me just get rid of that rest step altogether.
When in doubt, take it out.
And now let's look at that. And there we go. So we've got this output schema, type
Very nice.
object. If I,
No, we don't have a JSON formatter.
yep. So let's just move on. So now that we have that, we've got the sheet metadata. It's critical that when you're building these data gathering actions, you publish them before you test them in the actions that you're using them inside of. Reason for that being, we've talked about the action API, I think, before on other live coding happy hours. When we go and pick this action, when this thing is used, it's actually calling the action API. The action API expects the actions it's calling to be published, and if they're not published, it's not going to work. So,
That
now,
seems reasonable.
I think so.
That the API wants to call published things. Like that seems very reasonable. Andrew from Australia suggests that the output from our script step was set to string and not JSON.
It needs to be JSON though. That's a requirement.
I probably missed that.
Oh, did it?
Sounds like a good catch. Let's take a look. So here's the script step, and you're absolutely right. So we'll set that to JSON. We'll republish that. Oh, I have to.
Having 50 eyes on the same problem might solve a few things.
It's helpful.
It's one of those times where it might have been, as much as I get frustrated in Flow Designer when types are locked down and angry, that might be one with the special output variable type that it only accepts JSON into its data pill dropper.
That's fair. So I'm just going to set up a dummy trigger that doesn't mean anything. And then what I really want to do is I want to go and choose that action where, let's see, we were doing get row from sheet.
Yep.
Yeah. And then on the right, you probably missed it, but there was a little spinner for a moment right next to this thing called row. And what it was doing is that spinner will run while we're fetching the metadata. If I expand it, there we go. There's label 1 and label 2. So what's pretty interesting about that is that, this is just static, but as you can now imagine, we can go get this data from somewhere else.
Hey, Josh, and just
That's
one thing to point out is that when I was using that for dynamic inputs, one of the things that does, I think it's probably not going to be a big issue at like develop time and use time, but at the point where you're building these, the caching can be significant, right? Like figuring out what's being cached when is was a tricky thing for the only really and truly the point you're at right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
when
the caching.
When we were doing for the VM system, right, Dave?
Mm-hmm.
I remember that, and we were like, "Is this really getting it, or is it?" Yeah, that was a lot of trouble right then with the caching because we weren't sure always whether or not we were getting the correct data.
Right. We would make a change and republish to the data gathering action, but then when could be guaranteed that the dynamic input was going to use, actually call that again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I imagine you have the identical issue right here.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you were just describing is what's happening because I just changed that action and then I came here, re-added it, and it was the same thing. So I think, yeah, there's definitely some caching. Let me go ahead and refresh this, and let's see what happens.
Oh, I saw the spinner.
And there we go. So now we've got label 1, 2, and 3 because I added the third one in there. And really the only thing I'm showing there is that by changing this action, we're changing the output structure, which is really what the power of this whole thing is.
Right. And once you stop hard coding that and instead are building it dynamically from an endpoint, then that's where all the bells and whistles go cling clang.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think the particularly, like, let's say that you are populating that, and this whole thing right here is like going out to the Google Sheet and generating those dynamically. Like, if you add a new column at 10:00:00, you may not see it in your flow at 10:01, right? Depending on when the last time you pulled that up, and et cetera, et cetera. So there may be a little bit of latency, like when you're using this even.
Yeah, that's a fair point too. Yeah, if the other system is changing, and I guess something like Google Sheets is a lot more likely to change quickly because you can just go in there and throw in a new column and it's no big deal. For other systems that are a little bit more stable, that probably have to go through change control in order for those kinds of changes to happen, it's less likely to be an issue. But yeah, that's definitely a consideration, depending on how you're and why you're building these dynamic outputs.
Yeah, for things like, and so for like AWS VMs and Linode VMs, right? The regions are like a classic example of a thing you might want to use for a dynamic input for, because they change over time, but they don't change every day, you know? So I guess I don't, and it's one of those things where I don't think we can guarantee like when you would see it, but I know that like when I was developing it, and I want to say the recommendation, Andrew, do you remember? It seems like the client side cache buster thing that you type into the JavaScript console was like the most reliable thing we found at develop time. And I don't actually remember what that was because that was like 4 months ago.
Yeah, I don't remember, anything. So the name of a thing is definitely outside my bounds.
That makes more than one of us. So at this point, I do want to be cognizant of the time.
We're good. 3:12.
3:12. Okay, good. So what I'm going to try to do.
So we could probably, get roughly set up for authentication and maybe try and take a swing at it, but we don't need to swing for the fences.
Fair enough. So what I'll do is I'll at least get a connection set up. I'll see if I can hit the API, and if we're able to actually get some responses back from the API, and then we'll see how far we can go. So if I come back to Flow Designer, let me just pick my Google Sheets, and there we go. We've got our base URL, and then our resource path was v4 spreadsheets and spreadsheet ID. So we're going to do a / and then we'll take our,
create a input for that.
Yeah.
Oh wait, so it needs a input for the dynamic creation part. Yeah,
it does. And actually that's a good.
How do you send that to that?
I'm glad you asked.
Because I'm not directly calling that thing. So where do I get prompted for it?
So I've defined the input now and I've got it in my resource path. But if I go back to my get row from sheet action after it finishes saving, and I go to my output definition, you'll notice that the sheet ID is now showing up.
I remember that.
And then the cool thing is you can say
same thing
depends.
for dynamic inputs.
It's very similar to dynamic inputs. Yep. And then if you say depends on another input, you can say that I'm going to get this from an input on this action, which actually is going to be
the thing that the user will see in their flow.
Now, what we actually might want, and this is a future enhancement to this, would be dynamic input to give me a list of all the sheets that I can pick from, and then I just grab it from a dropdown.
Right. So that flow builder can choose the sheet from the dynamic list of inputs of sheets from their account. Or
Yep,
whatever.
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That sounds like that's connecting all the bits now. Dynamic input and dynamic output.
It's almost like they were meant to work together.
Almost.
In 2 different releases.
So with that, we've now passed the sheet ID into our dynamic input data gathering action. And let's look at this. I doubt this is going to work if I just test it, but I want to test it anyway and see what happens, and then we'll start filling things out.
You get a whole bunch of JSON back. Did you have anything in that sheet? It looked like a blank sheet.
When
we looked at Google.
It was blank. Yeah. So there'll be some metadata, but that's about it.
Okay.
Okay. Well, this is a take a drink moment because we just made an API call.
You got an API call.
I think that was record time too.
It really, really was. So what's interesting here, I'm feeling bold. We're not going to actually get what we want, but what I could do is I could show, if we were to loop through the top level properties, we could at least set up some dynamic inputs for these properties so we can show kind of how it works. Those aren't the ultimate dynamic outputs, I'm sorry, that we want, but
yeah, but it's essentially the same thing. Like
yeah, and we've got the data there and it's available to us. So
well, there's a good point. You're using get sheet metadata as a subroutine in effect for dynamic input and a dynamic output.
Yeah. Now, the one thing with that to keep in mind is that the input and output structure may not be the same, because the outputs, you have to specify the entire schema of a complex object.
True.
But there still may be some reuse possibilities. Or depending on the input type, you could specify an input that was like, give me output structure or give me input structure, and then it could return the right thing depending on how you call it. So let's say response body equals, let's actually pull the response body in. And we'll just say JSON.parse. And then now I need to go back and look at the executions because I can't remember. I've already forgotten. Whoops.
I thought you copied the structure into your.
I should have, but I did not.
Looked like you were doing it, but I couldn't see, your keyboard click. But it looked like you had copied it. Get sheet metadata. Is that 12 minutes ago is too long ago, sir.
I'm going the wrong way.
That doesn't look like the right one.
What are you looking for?
Yeah, let me just test this again. I'm looking for the output of that test that we did. And
oh, right.
For some reason, I'm missing that. So
the one 2 minutes ago should have been it, but it didn't look like it was.
Yeah, this is what I wanted.
Yeah.
So let me actually copy that. So what we actually want is everything inside of properties. So for each property, we're going to create an output. So I'm just going to set this up a little differently. I'm going to say data.
And so now we want to get the properties from that, right?
Yeah. Object. And we're going to say children are
properties
fields. And I'm going to go and create something called fields now. And then set it. So let's do this. Let's comment this out. I can scroll.
Oh.
I haven't written code in a long time. Give me a break.
We
didn't say anything.
Everybody who codes every day makes those same mistakes. That's not a rusty mistake. That's just
plan on doing that tonight.
Yeah. I took a drink for how many times I, screwed up putting in the comments and the right slash and star combination.
I have no liver.
In different languages, yeah. I would be a very poor man because I would run out of money.
So we should be able to do something like this where we're like fields.push, and then we're going to say label is is, I think, P. Well, we'll find out. And name is P, and we're just going to hard code everything to a string. We can be more clever about this, but right now I'm just going to hard code everything to a string and see what happens.
P was the key, so wouldn't one of those be response properties of P?
It probably is. Well, so that gets us the values, and the thing is, we don't really want the values at this point.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Normally, that's what we would want, but not for this kind of action.
And they're not giving it to us.
So let's do a test, and oh, that's handy.
Hey, you have it right there.
Ching.
Recover from that one quickly. And let's take a look at the output. And now let's see what we got. So there we go. Children, title, locale, auto recalc. I'm feeling good about this.
That looks like exactly what we wanted, and we should always know what we want before we press the button.
So I'm gonna
Know your code before you write your code.
I only write code by experimenting, and then I know what I want when I see it. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and go back to our test flow. We're going to refresh this. Let's see what happens.
And we expect to get
a
dynamic action error occurred.
Okay, that's good. We like errors because it helps us debug.
Yeah. So operation ended in an error state. So if we go back, we can now look at the executions, and what's cool is
it's got an error.
It's got an error, and
unexpected
token.
You're using JSON where you don't expect it. All right.
Oh, I see what happened. I didn't pass in. Somehow, I'm getting
HTML. You got the 404 page.
We were parsing the.
I like this. That's all we know. So let's see if we look up here at the data pills, action.sheetID did not get passed through.
Did we not set it in our action input properly?
You are correct. We did not set it in the flow itself.
There we go.
That would do it.
That'll help.
So now that we specified it, boom, look at that.
Bam! That's exactly what we expected. Yay.
Beautiful.
All right. Well, that feels like a reasonable wrapping up point then.
I think it is. And so I think the only things that we would need to do from this point forward is, instead of going and just reading the static metadata about the sheet, we would actually go get some details from the sheet.
We want the row headers.
And the dynamic inputs would be similar concept too.
Yeah, dynamic inputs, similar concept. So we're really close. It's just a matter of kind of tweaking that API call a little bit and then switching it over. So.
And you do have a couple things to think about in that, like what happens if there are more than one sheet? Because that is like that Google thing is a workbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could assume the first one, like index 0, you could, make some decisions.
Or dynamic outputs can cascade, or they can be dependent upon each other. So you could say, pick a sheet, and then from that sheet have a dynamic input that gives you a list of the sheets. So then you pick the sheet.
Would you have to do that at request time, or would you just kind of index the JSON that you like? Would you get an overarching JSON that said, okay, here's spreadsheet, here's sheet named X that has these columns, and you have basically an array of those JSON objects. Can you build all those things the one time and then the dynamic output, or is it refetching each time you change it?
It's refetching each time, because you don't necessarily know
it's going to change.
Depends on your inputs, you're going to get some other output. And then the same thing with the inputs. So if I had a dynamic input that said, give me a list of all my sheets, and then once I pick the sheet, it's like, give me a list of all the tabs within the sheet, again, it's going to go each time. So it is going to be numerous calls.
So you would actually have two data gathering actions. You'd have a get sheet action, and then you'd have a get column action that would take the sheet as an input.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very similar to if you were talking to ServiceNow, you'd have get tables, so you can pick which table you want, and then once you pick the table, it's got to call and say, well, what columns are in that table?
Now, the other thing you could do is, if there was an API on the Google side that gives you enough information to know all that in one response, You could create a single action with an input, and then depending on the input, you decide what to actually return. So you'd be like, just give me the overall metadata, or give me the sheet names, or whatever the thing is. And so then you could consolidate and have a single action if Google supported that.
Cool.
That was pretty neat. So what else did you want to share, just verbally about Integration Hub or Flow Designer?
Data transforms.
Orlando.
Yeah.
Like you were hovering over data pills with the FX popping up, and I almost interrupted you several times. I was like, you want to click that button for us?
I can reshare my screen for a quick second. It's worth it.
It's worth it. It's worth it.
So there's so much good stuff, but you'll see now there's this new FX on any pill you hover over, and when you click it, it opens up a list of transforms. And so this looks like the action picker, but it's a transform picker. And think about this like formulas, like in Excel or something like that. And you can do things like date and time transforms, or I want to go and do string transforms. Give me the lowercase, give me the first character, give me the last character. Another really cool one is if I go to something like SSH, and if I drop a data pill into this command,
What happened?
Drop it in the command, we immediately open you directly to sanitize shell arguments, because like you should really do this. And so we're going to guide you through that.
Or sanitize SQL, and I like the fact that you can stack them up too. So if you've got like a comma separated argument or something, and you say, I need the first argument, you can split it. You can take the first element and you can take the size of that thing and go, how big is it? Very, very easy to stack those up where it says applied transforms. I thought that was really cool too.
Yeah. So that's going to be helpful. This is going to get you out of having to go and write an action to do one really simple thing, or drop into inline script to do that simple thing. So we're going to continue to expand on those. We didn't talk about authentication algorithms. This is a new functionality where we can define entirely new outbound authentication types. Things like I want to talk to Amazon Signature version 4, or I have some API that expects me to get a thing and then put it in this weird custom header and somewhere in the body, totally non-standard stuff. So in the past, you would have to just kind of do that all in script in your actions, but now you can actually create new credential types that work just like other credentials and handle it for you. So that's a whole live coding happy hour in and of itself.
That is a whole.
Well, we did this, right? It was Google where we had to write an OAuth script, because where that token went was in the wrong spot for Google.
It went in there somewhere.
Google. Yes.
Yeah.
So we had to write a script for that.
Had to do that. Yeah.
And then occasionally I forgot that whenever I was, trying to redo Google stuff in a different instance, and I had to go back to the instance where we built that script, and I'm like, oh yeah, here, let's move this over here because I need this. But so that'll be actually very useful. And we will have some blogs on these things over the coming weeks, and we'll do more shows. But anything else you want to highlight real quick?
I think I'm all out for today.
All right.
There's more stuff. There's more stuff, but we're at time, and I would rather have more time.
We are right at time. The one thing to note is, we do have Josh on. He is a product manager for Integration Hub, and the product managers, they do utilize the idea portal. So submit your ideas there for improvements to the platform. So
it's on the community. It says idea portal right at the top. Make a post, upvote something that's there.
Yeah. So go look at those and upvote the ones that you think are important to get prioritized for us to work on. And they do actually go look at that, right?
We do. And maybe someday we'll show off the new thing on Live Coding Happy Hour.
Awesome. So as I said at the top of the hour, get your new Orlando instance or upgrade your existing personal developer instance, developer.servicenow.com. Visit us on the community, on the developer site, the developer blog. We've got blog entries from these wonderful folks here. And now we will wrap up with our ceremonial rating of our beers. Back to the original order. So Dave,
Rolling Rock is a known quantity. Let's give it a 3.25.
Is that with the success factor?
Yeah.
That's just where Rolling Rocks lives.
The Singularity Oatmeal Stout, that's a solid 4.
Nice.
Pretty good. It's pretty good.
I gave the Guinness Blonde a 3.75. Nice and refreshing. And I definitely will be referencing this video on the next Tech Now, where we show off the Orlando features.
Oh, wonderful. And my New Belgium juicer was quite good. So I'm, you were right to be a little jelly there, Josh.
Wait, hold that up again. Juicifer, like Lucifer.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
I even got the glare off of there for you.
It's juicy.
It is, and it was quite tasty. So I think that gets a 4.25 from me.
Wow.
That
Okay.
is
Was it
quite
hoppy? Was it citrusy? What was the character?
It wasn't particularly hoppy, no, because I don't like particularly hoppy things. It had a little of citrus to it, but juicy going to it, not hoppy.
Okay.
And I liked it. So that was wonderful. Thank you, Josh and Dave, for coming back and joining us. We hope we see you again, and not to the super far future. Knowledge, the sessions are starting to get posted. I know the pre-conference training has been posted, so you can go check out what's available for pre-conference for Knowledge 20 in Orlando. The Orlando release is out, and we'll be in Orlando talking about Orlando. And anything else from anyone else?
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.